All right, so we're back and ready to jump into some more Spinoza.
Part 2 of the ethics.
Yeah, on the nature and origin of the mind. At least that's how Els translated it.
Right.
So, maybe not typical light reading. But
Okay.
Spinoza had some pretty wild ideas, even for the 1600s. I mean, we're talking about a guy who basically said, forget the personal God.
Right.
God is thought, like the essence of thinking itself.
It was a pretty radical departure. I mean, he was challenging those conventional ideas of God
Yeah.
as this separate being who just kind of created the universe and stepped back.
Mm.
Spinoza was saying, no, God is deeply intertwined with everything, including our own minds.
So it's like our thoughts are just tiny ripples in this giant ocean. So, but
Exactly.
God's infinite intellect.
I like that, the ocean analogy,
Yeah.
because it really gets at that idea of everything being connected. Like,
Yeah.
those waves are modifications of the ocean.
Mhm.
Our minds are modifications of God's substance.
Okay, that makes sense. But then how does the whole mind-body thing fit into this? Because we always hear about how Spinoza saw those as connected too, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's a really key part of his philosophy. He saw mind and body as two sides of the same coin, not separate entities, but expressions of the same substance
Okay.
through different attributes.
So one substance, but viewed through like the lens of thought on one hand and physical stuff on the other.
Yeah, thought and extension. It's called the concept of parallelism. Like, imagine a coin spinning in the air.
Mhm.
You see either heads or tails, depending on how we look at it, but
It's still just one coin.
exactly. And changes in the body are mirrored in the mind and vice versa.
Mhm.
They're inherently linked.
Okay, so that makes sense. But then how much agency do we have in all this? Because Spinoza also talks about ideas being active forces
Yeah.
shaping our perception.
Right. He makes a distinction between what he calls adequate and inadequate ideas.
Okay.
And this comes down to the idea that we only truly know our own body's modifications, meaning we can feel a sensation or have a thought, but we don't directly experience the thing in the outside world causing that sensation or thought.
So you're saying our understanding is based on limited information.
Exactly. Think about it like this. You see a shadow and immediately assume it's a person
Right.
until you get closer.
Right, and you realize, oh,
It's a tree.
it's a tree.
Yeah, that initial perception was an inadequate idea
Okay.
because it was based on incomplete information.
So we're constantly forming these ideas based on our senses, but those senses can be misleading.
Yes.
And that's where Spinoza says reason and intuition
Exactly.
become crucial.
Because they can lead us toward those adequate ideals.
What exactly did Spinoza mean by reason and intuition?
Well, he actually outlined 3 kinds of knowledge. So there's the knowledge from the mere suggestion of experience, which is often where those errors creep in.
Right, like the shadow being a person.
Exactly. And then there's reason, where we use logic and adequate ideas to get at the truth, like what we do in science or math.
Okay, so that's about using our brains to figure things out.
Yeah, going beyond just our immediate sensory experiences. And then the third kind, the highest kind of knowledge, according to Spinoza, is intuition.
And that one's always been a bit trickier for me to wrap my head around.
It's a bit harder to pin down, but you can think of it as that immediate grasp of truth, like a sudden aha moment where something just clicks into place. Like when you suddenly understand a complex concept
Right.
or see the solution to a problem you've been struggling with. He uses the example of finding the 4th proportional number.
Okay.
So say you have 2, 4, and 6, and you're trying to figure out what number comes next in that sequence, maintaining those same proportions.
Okay.
Now, someone might rely on memorized rules. Maybe they multiply 6 by 4 and then divide by 2. That's knowledge from experience,
Right.
but it's not necessarily the most reliable. Someone else might use the principles of proportion, setting up an equation
Right.
to figure out the answer. That's knowledge through reason.
Okay.
But then some people, without doing any calculations, they might just see that the answer is 12.
They just know it.
Yeah, that's intuition. It's like they've grasped the underlying relationship so completely
Wow.
that the answer becomes self-evident.
Okay, so different ways of arriving at the same answer, but some offer a greater degree of certainty or clarity, maybe.
Exactly. And Spinoza would say we should always strive for that level of intuitive knowledge, not just about collecting facts, but understanding the deeper connections and causes behind things.
And this is where it starts to tie back to his whole idea of God, right?
Yes.
If everything is a modification of this thinking substance,
Right.
then understanding those connections is like getting closer to understanding God or nature itself.
Exactly. And that brings us to another potentially mind-bending idea and Spinoza's view on free will.
Okay, here we go. This is the one I've been waiting for.
He argued that our choices are actually determined by a chain of causes,
Hmm.
rooted in our past experiences and the structure of the universe.
Wait, so you're saying even that seemingly random memory that just popped into my head was predetermined?
Well,
That's kind of wild.
it's definitely a challenging concept to grasp, but think
Yeah.
about it this way. If you could trace back every thought, every experience
Right.
that led to that specific memory surfacing,
Mm.
you might see all these connections you never even realized were there.
Okay.
And rather than feeling like a lack of control, maybe this encourages us to be more aware of how our past is always shaping our present.
So instead of feeling trapped by fate,
Hmm.
we gain a different kind of freedom through understanding those influences.
Exactly. It's a shift in perspective. And I think that's what makes Spinoza's work so enduring. These ideas about God, mind, body, free will,
Yeah,
they might have seemed radical in the 17th century, but they still resonate today.
they really do, especially now when we're constantly bombarded with information, conflicting opinions.
Absolutely.
It's more important than ever to be able to think critically, to dig deeper, question our assumptions.
Yeah, Spinoza was all about that,
Yeah,
not taking things at face value.
and that's a good place to pause, I think. We've covered a lot of ground. God as thinking substance, the interconnectedness of mind and body, the power of ideas, and even got a little taste of controversy
Right.
with the free will discussion.
But we're just getting started.
We are. Next time, we're going to dive into how Spinoza saw imagination shaping our understanding of these big abstract concepts like being
Yeah.
thing.
He had some fascinating ideas about how the limitations of our imagination actually contribute to the formation of these concepts.
Okay, now that's something I'm definitely going to need to hear more about.
It's a really intriguing part of his philosophy.
Yeah, can't wait. Okay, so last time we ended on this idea that our imaginations play a role in how we understand these big abstract concepts. I'm ready to hear more about that.
Well, Spinoza had this really fascinating idea that, in a way, our imaginations are kind of limited.
Limited.
Yeah, he argued that our human bodies, they can only handle so many distinct images at once.
Okay.
And this limitation, as strange as it sounds, it really impacts how we form these, like, ultimate abstract ideas.
So when you say images, are we talking about mental pictures? Like, there's a limit to how much our minds can actually visualize.
Exactly. Think of it like your mind has this capacity, right,
Yeah.
for holding these clear, separate mental snapshots.
Okay.
But if you try to cram in too many, it's like they start to blur together, you know?
I can see that. It's like when I have too many tabs open on my computer, things get jumbled. I can't even remember what I was working on.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I think we've all been there. And Spinoza believed this happens on a conceptual level, too.
Mm-hmm.
When we're bombarded with a ton of images, let's say, of all these different people we've met,
Mm-hmm.
our minds try to, like, simplify things
Right.
by focusing on what they all have in common.
So instead of remembering every single detail of each person, we create this general idea of man and lose all the specifics.
Precisely. It's like we form this composite image
Yeah.
based on the commonalities. But here's the thing. Everyone's experience is different.
Right.
So your idea of man might be totally different from mine. Like, maybe yours is built on the scientists you admire, and mine is more influenced by musicians, or something like that.
So we're all working with different mental building blocks. No wonder there's so much disagreement, especially in philosophy, when we're trying to define these big concepts.
Exactly. We're trying to build this tower, but with mismatched bricks. And Spinoza takes this idea even further. He argues that terms like being and thing, those ultimate abstract notions, they come about when our imagination hits its limit.
When we're trying to grasp too much at once.
Exactly. When we try to hold all those images in our minds at the same time, they kind of melt into this single, undifferentiated concept. We lose sight of the specifics, and we're left with just this hazy sense of somethingness.
It's like our brains are hitting the overload button and just lump everything together into one giant hazy category.
Perfect analogy. And Spinoza saw this as like the root of a lot of confusion. We mistake these hazy general notions for clear, distinct ideas about reality.
Okay, that makes sense.
But without those clear and distinct ideas, we're just setting ourselves up for all sorts of errors,
Yeah.
in how we understand the world.
So how do we escape that trap? How do we move beyond these vague notions and actually get to, like, real knowledge?
That's where those three kinds of knowledge come back into play. We talked about them before, remember? Knowledge from the mere suggestion of experience, which is often misleading.
Yeah, like the shadow we mistake for a person. Our senses deceive us.
Exactly. And then there's reason, which is about using logic,
Hmm.
adequate ideas to figure things out, like in math or science.
So it's about moving beyond just what we see and feel and using our intellect to really understand things.
Yeah, precisely. And then finally, that highest form of knowledge, according to Spinoza, yeah, yeah, intuition, which is always a little hard to describe.
Right.
But it's that direct grasp of truth, that aha moment, where something just becomes undeniably clear.
But isn't that aha moment still based on some knowledge we already have? Like, how's it different from just suddenly understanding something through reasoning?
That's a great question. It's subtle, but think about it this way. With reasoning, we're kind of piecing together information step by step,
Right.
like solving a complex equation. But with intuition, it's as though we're grasping the entire equation at once.
Hmm.
We're seeing the solution inherently. And remember, Spinoza thought we have the most complete knowledge when we have an adequate idea of something.
Yeah.
So maybe intuition is a way of getting at that complete idea.
Wow, okay. It's like instead of getting lost in all the individual trees, you're suddenly seeing the whole forest.
Exactly. And remember that example of finding the fourth proportional number?
Yeah.
That was Spinoza's way of illustrating those different types of knowledge.
Right. 2, 4, and 6. And we're trying to figure out what number comes next.
Yeah, so a tradesman might just multiply 6 by 4 and then divide by 2, just going off of some rule he memorized.
Okay, that's the knowledge from experience.
Right, but it's not super reliable.
And then someone else might use proportions, like a mathematical equation, to get to the
Well, it's
answer.
reason.
Reason, right?
But then you have those people who just, without even thinking about it, they just know it's 12.
They just see it.
Yeah, that's intuition at work. They've understood the relationship so well
Hmm.
that the answer just appears self-evident. No calculations needed.
So different levels of understanding can get you to the same place, but some are more, I don't know, certain, clearer, maybe.
Exactly. And Spinoza would say we should aim for that intuitive knowledge whenever we can. It's not just about knowing a bunch of facts. It's about understanding the connections, the causes behind things.
And this is where it all circles back to God, right? If everything is a modification of this thinking substance,
Yes.
then striving for this kind of knowledge,
Right.
it's like we're striving to understand God or nature itself.
It's all connected. And that brings us to, well, a bit of a tougher question. How does this all play out in our everyday lives? I mean, if our choices are determined, like Spinoza said,
Yeah.
how much does this understanding actually change how we act? Well, that's where things start to get really interesting, because we're starting to bump up against the ethical implications of Spinoza's philosophy.
Hmm.
He might have argued that our actions are determined,
Hmm.
but he also believed that understanding those causes, it could actually lead to a greater sense of freedom.
Okay, so maybe not freedom in the traditional sense of like, I can just choose to do whatever I want.
Right. It's not about that. It's more about recognizing the influences that are shaping our choices and that awareness, that understanding.
Mhm.
That in itself is a kind of freedom. So it's like instead of feeling like we're just randomly making decisions, we start to see the patterns, the influences at play, and that changes things.
I see that, but there's still this one thing that I'm wrestling with. If everything is a modification of God and God is this perfect thinking substance, how do we account for evil? Doesn't that seem like a contradiction?
Now that is a question that's been puzzling philosophers for ages.
Yeah.
And Spinoza, he had a really unique and maybe even radical perspective on it.
Okay, I'm definitely intrigued. Lay it on me. Okay, so how did Spinoza address this whole problem of evil? Because it seems like a real head scratcher if God is supposed to be this perfect being.
Right. It's a tough one. But instead of getting bogged down in the traditional debates about, like, why a good God would allow suffering, Spinoza kind of flipped the script. He argued that what we perceive as evil, it's not some, like, inherent quality of the universe. It's more about our limited perspective.
So it's like those inadequate ideas we were talking about earlier. We're misjudging things because we only see a tiny piece of the puzzle.
Exactly. Spinoza believed that good and evil, they're really human judgments based on our desires or experiences.
Yeah.
Something that seems awful from one point of view might actually be neutral or even beneficial from a broader perspective.
Okay, so it's all relative. Like a forest fire might be devastating for the trees and animals right there, but it could also be necessary for new growth, for the health of the ecosystem as a whole.
Right. A perfect example.
Yeah.
Spinoza would say we tend to get hung up on the negative stuff because, we're naturally concerned about our own well-being and the well-being of those around us.
Yeah.
But from God's perspective, which encompasses all of existence, there is no good or evil. There's just the unfolding of nature according to its own laws.
Wow. Okay. So are you saying that we should just accept whatever happens, even if it seems horrific? Like, just shrug our shoulders and say, well, that's just nature taking its course?
Not quite. Spinoza wasn't advocating for passive resignation. It's more that he saw this understanding of the true nature of things, even the causes of what we call evil, as a way to empower us, to help us act more effectively and ethically.
Okay. So instead of getting caught up in judging whether something is good or evil, we should focus on understanding the causes behind it, like why people are suffering, and then trying to make things better.
Exactly. He believed that the pursuit of knowledge, especially knowledge of God or nature, was the path to true freedom and happiness.
Hmm.
The more we understand how everything is connected, the less we're swayed by those limited, egocentric perspectives that can lead to so much fear and hatred and suffering.
I'm really seeing how these ideas, even though they're from centuries ago, are so relevant to what's happening today. There's so much information out there, so many conflicting opinions.
Right.
And Spinoza's emphasis on clear and distinct ideas, on understanding those underlying causes, it's like an antidote to all the chaos.
Absolutely. He provides us with this framework for navigating the complexity of life, for arriving at a more grounded and meaningful understanding of ourselves and the world.
Hmm.
And that, for Spinoza, is where true freedom lies. Not in some illusion of complete free will, but in the power of understanding.
Wow. It's like he's giving us a roadmap to a more enlightened way of being in the world. Maybe there aren't any easy answers, but he gives us the tools for deeper understanding, for more meaningful action.
I think that's a great way to put it. And maybe the most important takeaway from all of this, from Spinoza's entire ethics, is that even if we don't have complete free will in that traditional sense, we can still choose to strive for greater self-awareness, to
Hmm.
cultivate our understanding of the world, to act in ways that bring more harmony and well-being for ourselves and for others.
That's a really powerful thought, and I think it's a perfect place to wrap things up. This deep dive into Spinoza has been a wild ride. It's really challenged me to rethink some of my most basic assumptions, to see the world in a whole new way.
I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, it's been eye-opening, and I hope it's done the same for you, our listeners. If you're feeling inspired to explore more of Spinoza's ideas, well, there's a whole universe of thought out there waiting to be discovered. But for now, we'll leave you with that. Keep seeking knowledge and keep diving deep. Until next time.